In the summer of 326 BC, a Greek soldier sat on a hot stone in a valley he had never heard of, in a country he could not name, 8,000 kilometers from home. He was not thinking about history. He was thinking about the weight of his armor in the heat, about the strange food, about the river his general had refused to cross, about whether he would ever see Macedonia again. Across from him sat a monk, shaved head, saffron robes, eyes that seemed to find the soldier's foreignness merely interesting rather than threatening. The monk needed something, not food, not water, not passage through the mountains. He needed to know what a god looked like. And the soldier, without knowing what he was doing, without any sense that this moment would matter, gave him the only answer he had. He described Heracles. That description traveled 8,000 kilometers. It took 800 years to arrive. And when it did, it was standing at the entrance to the most famous martial arts monastery in the world. Nobody noticed. Nobody planned it. Nobody got the credit. But this is where it started. The primary figure in the martial tradition of Shaolin monks was a guardian deity named Vajrapani. Vajrapani appeared to a monk in a spiritual session and promised him supernatural skills he could use in combat. And that deity was depicted in the form of a Greek god. That is not a theory. The British Museum has the stone and Shaolin has the stele, so the chain cannot be broken. It is visible. It is connected through the ages. The ancient world was not isolated. In fact, it was permeable. Water moves through rock, and in this story, water symbolizes culture, and rock symbolizes borders and all other restrictions. But how did it happen? History tells us that Alexander the Great reached the Indus River in 326 BC, 17,000 kilometers from his home, and his army stopped and refused to go further. He died shortly after at 32 in Babylon, and the empire was split among his generals. The eastern fragment, Gandhara, modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, was ruled by Greeks for 200 years. And you can imagine the cultural melting that was happening there. But here is what most people skip entirely. The Greeks who stayed in Gandhara did not simply maintain a military outpost. They built a civilization. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom, as historians call it, produced kings who spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and yet governed populations that were Buddhist, Hindu, and Zoroastrian simultaneously. One of those kings, Menander I, is actually mentioned in Buddhist sacred texts. He is remembered not as a conqueror, but as a philosopher, a man who sat with a Buddhist monk named Nagasena and debated the nature of the soul so seriously and so honestly that he eventually converted to Buddhism himself. A Greek king, a Buddhist convert, ruling from a palace in modern-day Pakistan. That is the world that produced Gandharan art. Not a world of two cultures clashing, a world of two cultures genuinely curious about each other. Greek soldiers did not leave. They settled. They married locals. They built Greek cities in Asian mountains. They minted coins, Greek gods on one side, local symbols on the other. And here the cultural melting journey begins. These soldiers were no longer purely Greek. They were something completely different. Why? Because of one critical point. Greek artists hired by Buddhist patrons needed pictures of deities that had never been depicted before. Buddhism in the 1st century BC had no visual tradition. There were no images, only symbols. They needed a school of visual art that could depict their deities, and Greek sculptors were a perfect fit for that task. They solved the problem the only way they knew, with Greek forms. That is how Vajrapani came to carry the form of a Greek god while holding the spiritual essence of a Buddhist deity. So what was Vajrapani? He was a deity who would stand next to the Buddha and protect his enlightenment, guarding him from all enemies. The job of the Greek artist was to depict this. They had one form in their minds for a muscular divine protector, Heracles, and their fusion produced a tremendous result, Gandharan art. The world's first fusion of Greek and Buddhist visual language. Evidence of this exists in the British Museum's stone relief from the 2nd century CE. The Buddha sits in a meditation pose while Heracles stands alongside him, guarding him, muscles carved in the Greek tradition. The fascinating detail is that the inscription says Vajrapani, but the body is Heracles. And that was not the only example. In the Kushan dynasty, there were coins showing Heracles on one side and Buddhist symbols on the other. So this fusion existed not only in art, but in the ordinary life of ordinary people. Cultural fusion, or cultural syncretism, if we speak academically. The lion skin, the defining attribute of Heracles, gradually became a Buddhist robe. The wooden club, another common attribute of Heracles, became the Vajra thunderbolt. Here is the detail that makes this even more remarkable. The word Vajra, the thunderbolt weapon that Vajrapani carries, comes from Sanskrit and means both thunderbolt and diamond, indestructible and devastating simultaneously. When Greek artists replaced Heracles' wooden club with this weapon, they were not simply swapping one object for another. They were participating in a theological translation. The club that Heracles used to kill the Nemean lion became the cosmic weapon that guards enlightenment itself. The form changed. The meaning deepened. It is already fascinating how cultures melted in this particular example. But nobody could have imagined where this fusion would go next. Now the main journey begins. Buddhism, the ship carrying Vajrapani, spreads east along the Silk Road, the ancient network connecting the Mediterranean to China, and Vajrapani, as a Buddhist figure, travels with it. Monks, merchants, and pilgrims carry texts and images. At every stop, this figure absorbs local culture. By the time he reaches China, there are no Greek attributes left. The lion skin is gone. The Greek club has been replaced by a Chinese staff. The Mediterranean face has been replaced by an East Asian face. But the identity, the very root of the form, is still there. The massive body, the weapon in hand, the guardian of the sacred, the protector against enemies. Buddhism officially enters China around 67 CE, and Vajrapani arrives with it, becoming the template for Buddhist temple gate guardians across all of East Asia. Shaolin Monastery was founded in 495 CE in Henan Province, China. By the 5th century CE, monks prayed to Vajrapani and received supernatural fighting strength. The earliest documented link between Vajrapani and martial power at Shaolin. Vajrapani was honored twice in formal stone steles at Shaolin, first in the 12th century and again in the 16th century CE. That second stele, the one from 1517, tells a specific story worth pausing on. The monastery was under attack. A group of rebels had surrounded Shaolin, and the monks were outnumbered. According to the stele inscription, Vajrapani appeared during the battle, a massive burning figure wielding his staff, and the rebels fled. The monks credited their survival entirely to his intervention. They erected the stone not as decoration, but as a permanent record of a divine rescue. The same guardian who had stood beside the Buddha in a Gandharan stone carving 14 centuries earlier was now defending a Chinese monastery from military assault. The form had changed completely. The function was identical. Scholar Meir Shahar in the definitive academic account of Shaolin, identifies Vajrapani as the central divine patron of the monastery. Not peripheral, central. Vajrapani as a Buddhist spirit was the central figure in the entire martial arts tradition of China, which means we can say that the entire martial arts tradition of China was built around a deity whose physical form came from ancient Greek civilization. That is an extraordinary thing to say, and the monks prayed to him before training and attributed their martial power to his blessing. An uncritical skeptic might say, they were praying to a European god. No. They were praying to their own god, an Indian god, an Eastern god. The only issue is that the material form of that god was borrowed from the Western visual tradition. Their prayer was entirely their own, and they had no idea that the form of Vajrapani was Greek. So the beautiful thesis of this story is that culture never carries a passport. It does not announce itself at borders. It moves through artists solving practical problems, through Eastern monks who faced the challenge of depicting their deities and turned to an available visual tradition to do it. Heracles never traveled to Shaolin. An idea traveled. An idea about what divine protection looks like. Muscular, dangerous, weapon in hand. That idea was old when Greece was young. It will survive long after Shaolin is gone. And think about what that means practically. Every time a Shaolin monk bowed before Vajrapani, every time he asked for strength before training, before a fight, before a moment requiring courage, he was unknowingly continuing a visual tradition that began on the other side of the world. The gesture was entirely his own. The image receiving that gesture carried a memory he could not access. Two civilizations sharing a moment of prayer across 8,000 kilometers and 800 years without either one knowing. It arrived in China wearing a Greek face that nobody recognized, which is perhaps the most honest thing culture has ever done. Nations tend to wall themselves off from each other, but they should look more carefully and see that their so-called unique identities are often only transformed versions of other nations' identities. And that is truly beautiful and uniting for humanity. It is also spectacular how an idea can travel 8,000 kilometers from one point of the earth to another and still arrive intact.